Rome is often remembered for conquering the world, but before it ruled anything, it had to survive a mountain war with an enemy so tenacious, so well organized, and so resistant to domination that it nearly broke the Roman Republic during its rise. This wasn't Carthage, it wasn't the Greeks, it wasn't even the Gauls. It was the Samnites, an ancient Italic people who didn't just resist Rome, they changed it. You've probably never heard of the Samnites. No epic movies, no Netflix series, no flashy ruins. But in the 4th century BCE, they were one of the most powerful and feared forces in central Italy. A tribal confederation, yes, but not primitive, not backward, and absolutely not easy to conquer. They weren't Rome's warm-up act, they were Rome's test. Over the course of 50 years and 3 long, bloody wars, the Samnites forced Rome to question everything about how it fought, governed, and expanded. And in one of those wars, they humiliated the Roman army so completely, it led to a total military reformation that became the foundation of Rome's future empire. Long before Roman legions set foot on distant shores, the Apennine Mountains in the heart of Italy were home to a people whose identity was forged not in cities, but in stone-built sanctuaries and wind-swept highlands. The Samnites weren't an empire, a kingdom, or even a centralized state. They were something different, something ancient. Organized as a confederation of tribes, the Samnites shared a common language, Oscan, but their political structure was fluid. Each tribe, whether the Hirpini, the Caudini, the Pentri, or the Caracini, governed itself with relative autonomy. There was no capital, no singular ruler. What held them together wasn't bureaucracy, it was culture, kinship, and a shared understanding of territory, religion, and survival in the mountains. And those mountains mattered. The Apennines weren't just a backdrop, they were a crucible. The geography forced the Samnites to master both mobility and resilience. They moved their livestock seasonally across altitudes in a practice known as transhumance, and their agricultural economy was deeply adapted to rugged terrain. Their settlements were typically hill forts, oppida, fortified not just against enemies but against nature itself. These weren't crude outposts, they were organized centers of community life, strategically positioned and often surrounded by dry stone walls that have lasted millennia. But perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of Samnite life is just how connected they were. Far from the image of isolated mountain warriors, archaeological finds reveal a people actively participating in Mediterranean trade networks. Imported Greek ceramics, Etruscan metalwork, and luxury goods have been uncovered in Samnite territory, suggesting they had access to and demand for foreign craftsmanship. They may not have built marble temples like their Greek neighbors, but they certainly knew of them and likely borrowed religious and aesthetic elements that blended with their own local traditions. Their religion was no less sophisticated. At the heart of their spiritual world was Heracles, yes, that Heracles, reimagined not just as a mythic strongman, but as a protective deity of warriors and oaths. In fact, the Samnites were known for their sacred war bands, devoted brotherhoods of young men bound by ritual and trained for combat. Warfare, for them, wasn't simply survival, it was ceremonial, sacred. This mixture of tribal autonomy, religious unity, and geographic advantage made the Samnites uniquely resilient and uniquely dangerous. They didn't seek conquest, but when it came, they were ready. Not because they had legions, but because they had each other. And Rome? Rome was about to discover what it meant to fight an enemy who had nothing to lose and everything worth dying for. As the 4th century BCE unfolded, the ambitions of Rome began to stretch beyond the Tiber. The once local power was no longer satisfied with guarding its borders. It wanted influence, first in Latium, then in Campania, a fertile and prosperous region nestled between Samnite lands and the southern coast. But that same region was also within the economic and military sphere of the Samnites, who saw Rome's advances not as diplomacy, but as encroachment. In 343 BCE, Rome and the Samnites clashed for the first time. What followed was a series of conflicts known collectively as the Samnite Wars, which would span nearly half a century. These weren't just border skirmishes, they were full-scale regional wars, pulling in other Italic peoples and forcing Rome to evolve in ways it never had before. The First Samnite War, 343–341 BCE, was relatively short-lived, sparked by a dispute over Capua, a wealthy Campanian city caught between the two powers. Rome entered the conflict as Capua's protector, casting itself as a liberator, a theme it would reuse for centuries. Although the war ended with Roman claims of victory, it was inconclusive. The Samnites retained their power, and Rome's influence in Campania remained fragile. The real struggle was only beginning. It exploded during the Second Samnite War, 326–304 BCE, a long and bitter campaign that would test the limits of Roman endurance. Early in the war, the Samnites struck a devastating psychological blow at the Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE. Here, a Roman army, overconfident and unfamiliar with the treacherous mountain terrain, marched directly into a narrow pass near Caudium, only to find both exits sealed. They were trapped, completely and utterly. With no path forward and no retreat, the Romans were forced to surrender without a fight. But the Samnites didn't slaughter them. Instead, they performed a deliberate act of symbolic domination. They forced the Roman soldiers to pass under the yoke, 3 spears arranged like a gallows, under which defeated troops had to stoop. It was a ritual of shame, a declaration that Rome had been humbled, not just militarily, but spiritually. Back in Rome, the defeat sent shockwaves through the Republic. The people were furious, the Senate was stunned, and the idea that the Samnites, a tribal federation, could embarrass Rome so completely was unthinkable. But it happened, and Rome had to respond, not with vengeance alone, but with reinvention. This is where the Samnites stopped being just enemies. They became catalysts. Rome realized its traditional tactics, based on the rigid Greek-style phalanx, were useless in the broken, hilly terrain of Samnium. The Samnites, by contrast, fought in loose, flexible units that could navigate mountain passes, retreat rapidly, and strike from unexpected angles. Their warriors were mobile, individually trained, and familiar with guerrilla-style engagements. Rome had a choice: keep losing, or change everything. And change it did. Before the Samnite Wars, Rome fought in the phalanx formation, borrowed from the Greeks. Picture a massive wall of spears moving slowly in unison, effective on flat land, terrible in the mountains. The Samnites, with their mobile, flexible style of combat, using small units, ambush tactics and terrain advantages, shredded the phalanx. Rome responded by developing a new system, the manipular legion. They divided their army into maniples, small, flexible units that could maneuver independently on rough terrain. This wasn't just a tactical shift, it was a full military revolution, and it was directly inspired by their fights with the Samnites. The manipular system became the core of Roman military success for centuries, and without the Samnites, Rome might have never developed it. So in a way, Rome didn't just defeat the Samnites, they became stronger because of them. The Third Samnite War, 298–290 BCE, was the final act. By now, the Samnites knew they couldn't beat Rome alone, so they formed a massive anti-Roman coalition, joining forces with the Etruscans, the Umbrians, and even the Gauls. In 295 BCE, both sides clashed at the Battle of Sentinum. It was one of the largest battles in Roman history up to that point. Tens of thousands of troops on both sides. Chaos, desperation, heroism. According to legend, Roman general Publius Decius Mus performed a devotio, a ritual suicide in battle, to gain favor from the gods. He charged into enemy lines alone, sacrificing himself to inspire his troops. It worked. The Romans barely won, but it was a brutal fight. The Samnites lost thousands, their coalition shattered, and with that their power was broken. The war officially ended in 290 BCE, but Samnite resistance would continue through revolts, assassinations, and alliances with enemies of Rome. Still, their autonomy slowly eroded. By the time of the Social War, 91-88 BCE, the last remnants of Samnite identity were fading, and by the 1st century BCE, the Oscan language was gone, the temples abandoned, the hill forts quiet. Rome had won. But this isn't just a story of defeat, because the Samnites left behind something even more powerful than territory or monuments. They changed the trajectory of Rome itself. They forced Rome to rethink war, to innovate, to adapt. They proved that tribal societies, without cities, kings, or empires, could challenge the most powerful forces of their age. And most of all, they showed that resistance, even in defeat, can shape the course of history. The Samnites may have disappeared from the map, but their fingerprints are all over the Roman military machine that would go on to conquer the Mediterranean. Sometimes, the people who lose the war still leave the deepest mark. If you found this story as surprising as I did, hit that like button. It really helps us reach more history fans. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the forgotten forces that shaped the ancient world. Want to see more lost civilizations that made empires tremble? You're in the right place. History isn't just about who won, it's about who changed the game. Catch you in the next one.